hello everyone again, and thank you to Lucy and Mark for putting together this event, which I know they've put a lot of work in behind the scenes. And before we start the panel, just a few points. The first one was just, I really wanted to say a heartfelt thank you to all of the educators on this call and the leaders in schools, because you know, it's easy to forget as we're going into this next phase that Kate was talking about, that you know, this was a huge effort and a selfless effort towards our children's learning. So I really wanted to say thank you. So a quick introduction of myself. My name is Sophie Bailey. I'm the founder and host of the EdTech podcast. Our mission is to improve the dialogue between ed and tech for better innovation and impact. So we quite often interview school leaders, such as we've got here today. We've got 30 minutes now, so I'm going to try and ask as many questions as we can to share as many insights from our fantastic guests. But before that, a big welcome to our guests. So I'll just quickly go over some introductions for those people who may have joined after today's keynote. So Nick House, who's with us here, is head teacher at Greenshaw High School. He was described apparently by Ofsted as having impressive clarity and drive, which I very much crave, having had a lockdown baby. So enjoy that, Nick. Kate Wragg is deputy head teacher at the Education and Leadership Trust and teacher of computing, and also the cross trust lead on e-learning and e-safety. So a powerhouse from Manchester with us. And hopefully later we'll also have Neelam Palmer, who is the director of e-learning at Ashford School. Neelam's written some great blogs for us on implementation of EdTech. So much to Kate's point about doing a few things well rather than trying to do everything and nothing sort of working. So look forward to welcoming you later. But as I mentioned, we'll jump straight in to get as much out of this session. So my first question is to Kate. Kate, Whalley Range, I hope I pronounced all these schools correctly, is a large 11 to 18 high school of 1,500 girls located in the heart of inner city Manchester. One of the schools is 1,000 girls. The East Manchester Academy is a mixed school of 970 students in the heart of Manchester's regeneration area, and the Education Leadership Trust serve some of the most deprived wards in Manchester and some of the most culturally diverse, with over 90% of sixth form students from ethnic minority backgrounds. So my question here was, first of all, that's a lot of students and a lot of individual needs. And, you know, it will be no surprise to many people listening in that school budgets are strapped. So I just wondered how you went about, you know, considering the investments, if there are any investments that needed to be made when you were sort of tackling this challenge, or whether you used existing tech. And that isn't necessarily investments in the monetary sense, but more, where did you focus your attention, whether it's on teacher training or implementing new technology to, you know, tackle that complex problem, essentially?
Hi, hello, thank you, Sophie. Well, quite a few bits to unpick there, I think, really. In terms of the tech, yes, there are shrinking budgets. I have to say the executive head and the head teachers at the Education Leadership Trust have been amazing and tried to protect a lot of the tech budget as far as we can over the last few years. So actually, the tech was all in place. One of the things that we found was that the staff, not all the staff knew how to use it properly. And that was the biggest thing for us. So we actually had the platforms, we had all of the connectivity that we needed. The biggie for us was that although a lot of the students have mobile phones, and in fact, in 2 of our schools, the students are on the Wi-Fi and are encouraged to bring their phones into school as long as they connect to the Wi-Fi, which is filtered. Obviously, we ran into problems when it came to students accessing devices, and we've lent out just about every single mobile device we've got. We've virtually stripped the schools in terms of lending those out. I'm in the process of trying to get them all back at the moment, which is my August challenge. Yeah, that is a biggie. We had devices that came through from the DFE, 136 devices across 3,500 children, so that didn't go very far. We've worked with local charities, we've worked with the local authority, we're just trying everything that we can really to try and get as many devices out there as possible. That's one of the reasons why we want to do another tech survey in September, because you know, even though we'd lent devices to households, we discovered perhaps that one household might have 5 children using one computer. So when we set up the timetable, one of the big challenges for us was not to have a timed timetable, because the students could be accessing it depending on when their time slot with the device was. And so we did a very similar timetable to the one that Nick showed earlier, and ours were called sessions, and they were hyperlinked through, but there was no prescriptive time. The only time that was prescriptive was when there were some live lessons via audio, some via video, but they were at drop-in points in the week. They weren't specifically, it's Tuesday, it's 10 o'clock, if you do business studies, you've got to be here. We ran as many drop-in points as we can to offer access, but it is a big challenge.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point about, you know, not having that luxury necessarily to have the whole day laid out. And I loved your point about making it bite-sized. So one thing that I experienced when I was doing the whole homeschooling thing was the information that we were receiving was in a kind of week block, you know, everything that you were going to do across the whole week. And I had this conversation with someone that the way it was written was more because teachers are used to communicating to perhaps a supply teacher. And so it was kind of written out. And as a parent, that could be sometimes quite overwhelming to try and unpick, okay, what am I doing? And yeah, I love the point.
Were you offered something half term 6, week 3? You know, one of those, every time I saw that bit on the screen, it just made my heart sink, because I thought the children don't know it's half term 6, week 3. They might know it's the 8th of July, but they don't know about weeks and timings. So I think that was, and that consistency of things is really important. Interestingly, you said about the shorter bursts as well. I mean, we went through a very steep learning curve in terms of learning how to record, store video footage if we were videoing lessons or videoing narrated PowerPoints. And the buffering, and people saying, well, I've put my lesson together. I say, yeah, but it's 20 minutes long. And actually the children are quite used to a 15-second TikTok culture. They're not going to sit there for 20 minutes while you're buffering. So we did learn an awful lot about keeping things short and keeping things in small blocks for management, really, all round, not just for the teachers, but for the children and the parents.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Kate. I'll come back to you in just a moment. I have a question for Neelam, but we'll come back to that one. So Nick, my question to you is, your school, if I understand correctly, is a large, mixed, comprehensive and a highly selective outer London borough. As I'm sure you will have noticed, assessment is a hot topic right now. So I was keen to find out how your school managed to continue assessing students remotely, and whether there's any learnings that we could take from this approach on a sort of more macro level with everything that's going on in the exams crisis right now.
Yeah, I mean, so one of our things that I'm really proud of is we're also a research school. So we were identified by the EEF as having some skills and knowledge and being a useful school to work with other schools across South London and the South East. And that means when you talk to me about things like assessment, I'm going to get really fussy and really detailed and pedantic about it. So assessment means lots of different things to lots of different people. In our school, we're really, really clear that enormous amounts of teacher marking is not assessment, is feedback. But where we want to assess, we want to really know what young people have understood and what they can do. And I think, if I'm absolutely honest, over the summer term, our greatest focus was not on assessment. I think we were quite clear that the nature of learning in a remote situation was going to be profoundly different. I did say in my presentation that where pupils returned work, we sampled their work. So if we had a class of 30 pupils, we asked our teachers to maintain a mark book and make sure that they had sampled work from 5 to 6 students in a class of 30, and they would differ from 5 to 6 pupils each time. And then we would give general formative feedback to those pupils. So these seem to be some of the misconceptions. This is the kind of thing that we think we might need to return to as a group. In terms of pure assessment, I think there are so many complicating factors. We're assessing for learning and to know where the kids are at. We're not assessing as a summative activity because you don't know how long they've spent on a task, what other external resources they might have used online typically. So I think the notion of assessment is actually really complex. I think if I'm also serious, the biggest area we sought to assess was kids' well-being. And that's incredibly difficult online. So you use proxies like engagement rates. So how frequently are people logging on? How frequently are they turning in work? And I genuinely, and I'm happy to say as a national state-paid DFE head teacher, that the biggest thing I was assessing for our young people was engagement rates, connectedness, and just being in the game. And I think that's the most important thing we assessed.
Absolutely, and I'm really pleased to hear you say that, because one of my big concerns was less the academic side for my son. It was more the socialization and him sort of being stuck here on his own was a bit concerning. And I loved your point on familiarity. We had a past guest on the podcast before called Ted Fujimoto, and he talks about school reform, and he talks about relationships, relevance and rigor. So this idea that actually the underpinnings of some of these things are actually quite boring. It's just, you know, it's the consistency, which isn't very glamorous, but is what kind of gets things done as well. But on the note of familiarity, before I move on, when our son came back, I was one of those parents that thought, okay, keep your school uniform on, because, you know, then you'll feel like you're doing your schoolwork and everything. And strangely, when he went back to school, they didn't have to wear school uniform. So that's the kind of topsy-turvy world we live in at the moment.
My sense of familiarity and routine has changed massively. I think when I was naive and a young teacher and didn't quite know what I know now, I thought that teenagers should be quite adaptable and flexible, because the world, as I saw it, was messy and complex and unpredictable. So therefore, why shouldn't teenagers be able to get one sort of lesson in history and a different sort of lesson in French? And now, as I'm also a parent of a teenager myself and a little older, I know that teenagers, particularly talking to secondary colleagues in this meeting, they've got a heck of a lot of change going on in their lives already, around their own identity, around their emerging sense of self. So to actually have some familiarity and routine is really reassuring. Yeah, it is quite dull, and yes, it's not some super breakthrough research PhD, but I think it's incredibly secure and helps young people feel stable and feel familiar, and I think teenagers need that as much as anything we can offer them, whether that's in the school or online.
Absolutely. We did an episode before on self-directed learning, and the question there was, you know, if teenagers don't have their prefrontal cortex completely developed, you know, are they actually capable of doing all the things that we would expect out of self-directed learning? And perhaps sometimes that's a bit of a big ask. So another question for Kate. Your responsibilities at ELT also cover e-learning and e-safety. And we've heard on the podcast about terrible sort of safeguarding incidents during COVID, as well as the sort of much documented attainment gaps expanding due to the digital divide. And you may have covered some of this in your last answer, but what's been your school's approach to these problems, and how can tech be used to perhaps sort of tackle some of them as well, if it can indeed?
Yeah, that was one of the things that really worried me, actually. Safeguarding has to trump everything really in schools. And one of the things that worried me about the DFE offer, as wonderful as it was, and there were lots of other offers from companies about lending kit, I actually asked somebody at the DFE in a phone call to them and said, can you just tell me, though, you're offering these webcam-enabled devices with internet dongles to the families who've got the least experience in terms of using these sorts of things safely? Well, you know, just generally from a work point of view as well as the safety point of view. You know, what safeguarding points are you actually going to put in there? And I think that in the end they did actually put in some web filtering. But I have to say, we have got some absolutely gifted technicians here, and my infrastructure manager is amazing, and managed to work out a way so that every device that we lent still went through all of our filters, and we actually have some software on computers, laptops as well that do tracking. And that's true whether you're a brand new year 7 or the executive head teacher. The same safeguarding software is on every single device in the school. Nobody's left out of that particular bubble, as it were. That's the other reason why we want our students on our Wi-Fi rather than on data plans. You know, we find very often parents come in and they say, oh, my child's done X, Y, and Z on the internet, but it turns out they've got an unlimited data contract. And actually, if they were on our Wi-Fi, they wouldn't be able to get to a lot of the things that are there. I suppose overall, you know, one of the subjects in our timetable as well was citizenship and PSHRE and e-safety, and we pushed an e-safety message out there every single week. But I don't know if Nick experiences the same things in his school, but the number of children who end up sitting there, usually in tears in my office, saying, I know I shouldn't have, but I did. It's a really hard message to get across. I mean, two things that strike me about teenagers, interesting what Nick was saying about teenagers. The other thing is a lot of people say, oh, teenagers use their mobile phones, they know what they're doing. But actually, a lot of teenagers don't know what they're doing with their mobile phones. They're really good at doing 1 or 2 small jobs, but they're not tech geeks. They're not forward thinking in terms of the damage that they might do. They're not experienced enough, I suppose, to understand how important this impact is going to be on their life. I've spent just as much time during lockdown emailing Instagram, emailing some of the big companies, asking them to take down posts, asking them to take down fake accounts. And we just keep trying, we keep putting the message out there, and we keep supporting the students and the staff when problems occur. But I would like to see some of the conversation change so that government are actually talking to some of these big social media companies. At the moment, if you're dealing with an issue with a young person on a social media platform, it's almost impossible to make headway with them. They're faceless sort of black holes that take emails, and they just don't respond no matter what you say. And I would like to see government tackling some of the big social media companies alongside some of the digital divide. Other than that, we just keep going with the lessons, we keep going, and more than anything else, we talk and we report. We were doing weekly phone contact with all of our students as well to make sure that they were okay.
Yeah, I love the idea. It's such a simple idea, and I know when you scale that up, it's a lot of work. But calling people individually, whether on their birthdays or other moments to check in, is massive. And I know I have friends that have been doing that, and the work involved. So I know Neelam hasn't been able to make it, but one point she made on a previous podcast was that in this age of remote learning, sort of the teachers that haven't perhaps where lessons aren't engaging, there's nowhere to hide because of the data that you've mentioned that you can collect in terms of perhaps people logging in and that kind of thing. So through looking at some of the back ends of these platforms, have you been able to redesign some of your lessons or sort of iterate what you're doing? And have you got any lessons to share with people that are watching or listening in about, you talked about earlier, making things smaller? If there's anything else like that you'd like to share, that would be great as well.
So one of the things that all of us are stepping into a slightly unknown world. And I think there are companies whose raison d'etre is online learning. So if you think about somebody like a maths provider, like Hegarty Maths, for example, they've learned this stuff, they've done this stuff, and they've gone through this a number of iterations. Schools do not have individual expertise to be able either to create the platform and the infrastructure or the pedagogy and the really known things that hook kids in. There are things about the way that Hegarty is designed that are really smart. There are things about the way Tassamide, the science quizzing platform, is designed that are really smart. So we had to stumble. and we had to make sense about what we were doing. One of the really, really good things was we went back to things like principles around teaching and learning. So the notion of what we call dual coding, that language, whether that's heard speech, should be backed up by visual representation. So an image on the screen should help reinforce the understanding that the young person gets of what's being said. And we looked at some of our earliest slides, and mostly staff were talking with slides in the background, and they were just really confusing. They were cluttered, they were overloaded, they were badly designed. And so we managed to do some insets. We did some staff training in virtual meetings in May and June, and gave some examples of some really brilliantly designed slides, and said this will help learning. Fundamentally, this will help really difficult concepts stick. And if we think it's difficult to teach difficult content when you've got an adult in the room that you can ask questions of, then amplify that by how difficult it is to learn in a remote setting. So that's one example of something that we learned about, not our lesson design so much, more of our resource design, and being able to take pictures and images of our most gifted teachers' resources and then share them with other people and say, we can all do this stuff if you really carefully think about it. And we've now got resources that will be good for time. So if we didn't have a lockdown for the rest of this school year, some of those resources would actually be revision resources and things we can start creating into a library of ongoing curriculum resources, especially where they've been really well designed and they're really fit for purpose. So yeah, there's an example of something that we've altered as we've gone. Fantastic.
Thanks, Nick. Kate, do you have anything to add or?
Yeah, very similar actually. One of the examples I was going to give was GCSE Pod, who we were setting some assignments, little things like a key question, which might be a multiple choice question, where again, they've done so much thinking, just to reiterate what Nick says, they've done a huge amount of planning and work behind the scenes. So they'll ask a question, which is a very, on the face of it, a relatively simple multiple choice question, where the right answer is obviously the right answer, but the wrong answers all pick up key misconceptions. They're not just randomly put in there, they're actually put in there to test if a misconception has occurred, so that if the child actually gets the answer wrong, it can then lead them on to, well, you've given that answer.
See if Kate comes back.
X, Y, or Z.
So Nick, it's, oh, there we go, you're back. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think that's, Nick was talking about assessment earlier, and really good quality assessment has to be crafted, and it takes time to do that. You can't write something very quickly, and really make sure that it gets to the nub of what you want to do. So that's why we've done an awful lot of sharing as well. So where people have put together questions, where they've put together lessons, where they've put together resources, where they've put together videos, they've shared, talked to the students. We've had staff sitting in with each other. When we started doing the live lessons, the staff sat in with each other, partly for a bit of solidarity, but also partly to learn how to do things with each other. They were absolutely fantastic. And the same thing about the slides. And as I said in my presentation, the thought of having a very densely packed slide on a very small phone screen was just something that was a no-no. So you might have noticed my slides, it's just a single big image, where we'd already been doing quite a lot of work on dual coding, and particularly for our students, cognitive overload was a really big driver before lockdown. So when lockdown started, we were talking to staff about actually doing simpler screens and narrated PowerPoints, and not having yourself appearing as a little person in the bottom of the screen, because that splits the attention of the students and becomes quite confusing. It's better to have a narrated PowerPoint with really simple points and leave pauses in there, or even have a slide, pause for 10 minutes and reflect on this. You don't really wait for 10 minutes, otherwise your video buffers. But it's, actually there were key points where we actually even had slides to tell children to stop and think, and actually do some reflecting before they moved on to the next bit. It's been a development of our teaching and learning. It's not new, but it's developed it very rapidly in a way that we were hoping to go. It's just developed it in a different time scale for us.
Brilliant. So, well, thank you so much. I was going to ask one more question, but we've run out of time. But perhaps you can pop it in the chat, which would be, we often talk about what we add to make teachers' workload less, and perhaps what we can do is have a think about one thing that you would take away. But I'll leave you to add that in the chat, and otherwise I will get told off by Lucy. And both of you, thank you so much for adding a bit of extra insight with this discussion, and thank you very much.